This is our agenda. We'll start here. So we'll start with a little bit about bone anatomy, what's about our bones and how bones function in the body. And then we're going to describe to you the nutrients that are important for healthy bones and give you some food choices to include those nutrients so you get them every day. We'll talk briefly about supplements, and then we'll finish up with some best practices like a take-home message. Keep going, this is just a header slide. Okay, so let's start with bone anatomy. Bones are organs of the body. We oftentimes don't think about them as organs. And the reason that we call them organs is because they contain blood and nerves and connective tissue. There are three types of bone tissue that you may be aware of. We have the compact bone, the hard bone, the spongy bone, which is the interior of the bone, and the bone marrow, which is basically down through the center. So the exterior or compact bone is also called cortical bone, and that's basically the hard bone that we see. 50% of our bone, mostly because it goes all the way around the outside edges, and it forms that protective layer for the inner bone or the matrix as well as the bone marrow. It's mainly composed of calcium phosphate, so it's not just calcium, but calcium phosphate, and that's they bound together to create that hard bone. Then we have the spongy bone or the trabecular bone, and that forms the interior of the bone. Makes up about 20%, the other left over. And it is relatively flexible, so it's kind of spongy. It's made up of collagen, so when you think about your skin and other areas of the body that are made up of collagen, it's definitely a key component for the interior of our bones. And then we have the marrow. So there are two kinds of marrow. We have red and yellow. The red bone marrow helps us form red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. So the red blood cells are what carries oxygen to all the tissues of the body. So not just the muscles, but also the brain. The white blood cells are part of our immunity. They fight off infection. And then the platelets, of course, help us with blood clotting. And they're also a system that helps to heal the blood vessels from damage. And then we have the yellow bone marrow, which is made up of fatty tissue that forms the cartilage, and also the bone itself and other fat cells. So let's look at bone function. So besides just giving us a place to hang our muscles and give our body structure, it's also important that bones help us do more things. Particularly, they help us to facilitate breathing, which we often don't think about how bones could help us. They protect our organs, particularly our heart and stomach and internal organs. And they play a major role in our immune system because of that marrow that is important for creating white blood cells that fight infection. And they help us to balance our electrolytes. So electrolytes are charged particles in the body like sodium chloride, a salt is an electrolyte. So they help us balance those electrolytes. You may not realize this, but we build bone in our youth, and after about age 24, we stop building bone. So that's why it's important to maintain the bone that we have. Early bone loss is called osteopenia, and if it progresses, it can become osteoporosis. And osteoporosis is actually a damaging of the internal matrix of the bone structure. So it's a weakening of that collagen inside the bone. It's not the hard part of the bone that weakens, but that flexible interior part of the bone that is damaged. And osteoporosis is the major cause of fractures in both postmenopausal women, but also in older men. More common in women, in general Asian women, because they tend to be small boned and more likely to weakly. Also, keep in mind, you might be taking medications like glucocorticoid steroids and other things that could affect your bone density. Calcium, everybody knows, the major building block. And 9% of the calcium that we have, 1% that's left over, is a matter of life or death. It is essential for life. In this 1% could cause the body then to pull calcium from the bone to maintain it. This 1% calcium is responsible for the acid-base balance of your blood, so the acidity of your blood, which is really important. If your blood becomes too acidic, you will die. Also important for the contraction of muscles, particularly the heart muscle, to keep the heart beating in rhythm. It helps with nerve transmission, and particularly in the brain, and the stimulation of those neurotransmitters that we talked about earlier that help make you feel good. It helps you regulate your hormones and your enzymes. It helps with blood clotting and blood pressure. And it's really the most important part is that if your blood calcium, that 1%, is low, you will steal calcium from your bones. So this is one of the main contributors to osteopenia and osteoporosis, is low blood calcium. Only about a third of the calcium that we eat is absorbed by the body, and we can only absorb about 500 milligrams at a time. And this diminishes with age, unfortunately. But the good news is the more calcium in the food, the less we absorb. But the vice versa is also true. The less calcium in a food, the harder your body works to absorb it. It's also important to note that a high sodium diet and a diet that is high in animal protein, like our standard American diet, both increase calcium loss. So the standard American diet, the typical Western diet, has animal products at least once a day, sometimes 2, 3, 4 times a day, very high in sodium. This contributes to bone loss. But the good news is that bone loss is usually a function of poor nutrition, which is something you can change, and you can change it today. The important nutrients include minerals like calcium, phosphorus, fluoride, magnesium, sodium, potassium. There's many more, boron, zinc, there's so many minerals. And it also includes vitamins, like vitamin D we get from the sunshine, vitamin K from our dark green leafies, vitamin A, which is basically beta carotene, from brightly colored vegetables, B6, folate, and B12, 3B vitamins, all important for bone health. So where do we find these food sources? Well, let's talk first about the high animal protein. So the standard American diet, or SAD diet, can contribute to leaching calcium from the bone. If you look at the icon on the right, you'll see the diagram of across the axis across the bottom is animal protein intake. And then on the y-axis is the rate of hip fractures. And you'll see that the more animal protein you consume, the more likely you are to suffer from hip fractures. Vegetable proteins do not seem to contribute to calcium loss. Here's the diagram with vegetable protein across the bottom and hip fractures. And you can see that the decline in hip fractures with more vegetable protein intake. So it's important to prioritize your plant sources of protein. And those include beans and lentils and split peas, soy products, your whole intact grains, and also your nuts and seeds are good sources of protein. Now, most people think that if they need to get calcium, they need to do dairy. We have been indoctrinated to believe that dairy products are the best source of calcium, and they are a rich source of calcium. But if you look at the diagram on the right, you can see that calcium intake across the bottom in grams per day I guess we'll go through the others. The dairy also contains saturated fat and cholesterol. And you might not even realize, too, that cheese has really high sodium. So we already said that sodium causes calcium to leach. And that dairy is often associated with lactose intolerance, and 65% of the world population is lactose intolerant. So the Harvard study shows that the calcium intake per grams per day from dairy versus the hip fracture, you can see that the more calcium intake that you take in every day from dairy products increases your risk of hip fractures. The United States at the very top of that list. We get a lot of calcium from dairy, but somehow it is not improving our risk for hip fractures. So other sources of calcium that might be better would include chia, poppy, and sesame seeds. Chia seeds are also a good source of omega-3 fatty acids. Almonds, white beans, and edamame, which are soybeans. So any kind of white bean like lima bean or cannellini beans, those white beans. You also get calcium from your dark green leafy foods. So who would have thought that dark green leafies actually provide calcium? Kale, turnip greens, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, and green cabbage. In addition to providing the cruciferous vegetables, providing the sulforaphane and indole carbanols for cancer prevention. Oranges and dried figs are good sources of calcium, and also fortified products. Some orange juice, soy, milk, and tofu are fortified with calcium. Remember that we said calcium phosphate is what makes up the hard bone, so you need to get that phosphorus. It's critical for bone health. And the plant sources include whole grains, beans, vegetables, nuts, and seeds. You're not going to get these from other food products. Magnesium, low magnesium is associated with osteoporosis. It's also very important for heart. And so you get that from your grains like quinoa, millet, brown rice, and even the germ of your wheat, which is why you want intact grains. You can also get magnesium from your vegetables like spinach and Swiss chard, sweet potatoes, artichoke hearts, also your beans and soy products. And your nuts and seeds. What you might start seeing is that just about everything you need for your bones is in nuts and seeds, particularly pumpkin, flax, and Brazil nuts and cashews. Obviously, vitamin D is important for our bones, but we're also finding that vitamin D is important for a lot of other aspects of our health. It helps us to lay down bone. It also regulates that 1% life or death blood calcium level. It enhances our immunity and protects us against a lot of other disease states. Most of the time, we get our vitamin D from exposure to sunlight, but in this region, not so much. You can get very, very small amounts of vitamin D from food like shiitake mushrooms that have been exposed to UV light, or as when I was a child, we took cod liver oil pills. Some vitamin D sources include the fatty fish like salmon, mackerel, and sardines, but remember those can also be very high in saturated fat and cholesterol. The same for egg yolks. You will get a little bit of vitamin D from fortified cereals and juices, but not necessarily the best option. Supplementation is, in this region, the best option. Potassium is really important for blood pressure, but it also helps to reduce the alcohol acidity of your blood. And the cantaloupe, honeydew, melon, apricots, papayas all provide potassium, as well as, there we go, dark green leafies, your carrots, potatoes, tomatoes, and your legumes or beans. And also you're starting to see almonds and pistachios. So when I say nuts and seeds are really giving you just about everything that you might need for healthy bones. You do need vitamin K to protect your bones. That's found in your dark green leafies like kale, Swiss chard, spinach, parsley, and some dried herbs, and also your cruciferous vegetables we mentioned earlier. Spices like paprika and chili powder can provide some vitamin K, and soybeans, dried fruits, and olive oil. One thing to keep in mind that vitamin K is produced by healthy gut bacteria. So fermented foods provide probiotics, and then you feed your probiotics with prebiotics, which is the fiber found in plant foods. Other minerals like copper and zinc, they're very important for bone production, connective tissue, particularly that interior of the bone. And you can find that mostly in grains, nuts, potatoes, and leafy greens. You should start to see a pattern here. Zinc also is protective for your bones. You also find zinc in food sources that include nuts and seeds. One more, yeah. There we go. And a little bit in seafood. So let's move on to supplementation. Most people try to supplement with calcium. There are several different forms of calcium supplements. It's important to note that calcium carbonate has about 40% calcium. Now, none of them is 100%. Then we have calcium citrate, which is, I think, the most common, calcium lactate, and calcium gluconate. But we need about 1,250 milligrams per day, but you have to get that much just to get 500. So that number, you can only absorb 500 at a time. So that's why you end up taking these massive calcium pills 3 or 4 times a day. The needs may vary depending on your age, but for the most part, we're looking at about 1,200 milligrams of calcium per day. So if you can get the majority of that from food by eating your greens and your beans and your nuts and your seeds, then you don't need to supplement with a large amount every couple of hours. Vitamin D, the RDA is usually about 1,000 to 2,000 international units per day, but here in Oregon, we recommend sometimes an upper limit of like 2,000 to 5,000 a day because we have so little exposure to sunlight. If you're overweight or obese, which is like 60% of the US population, you're going to need more than that. And so it's really important that you get your vitamin D tested from your local healthcare provider and that you know your starting point so you can see whether or not you need to take more than that. And B12, I mentioned there are several B vitamins. B12 is also very important for healthy bones, deficiency of which can lead to fractures. It's mostly found in animal foods, so if you're cutting back on animal foods, which I highly recommend for a healthy body, you still need to find your B12, and most of that is in animal products. So if you cut back on animal products, you really need to supplement. And there's also quite a bit of research that says if you're over age 50, even if you're still eating animal products, you should supplement with a B12 because we don't digest it as well as we used to. And the supplement should be sublingual, under your tongue, or chewable because you can absorb B12 through the mouth. And the problem is that the intrinsic factor in your stomach is what's not working well as we age. So you don't want to swallow it in a multivitamin. You want to get a sublingual form. Okay, so that's quite a bit of information. Trying to wind up, let's give you some best practices. Remember that 99% of calcium in your bone is great, but it's that 1% that is really important. And a drop in that could be fatal. So you'll pull the calcium from your bones to keep that 1% maintained. And you want to maintain your blood calcium by providing foods that are rich in calcium, phosphorus, and other minerals. So you want to include those white beans like navy and lima beans, kale and other leafy green vegetables, your almonds and sesame seeds and chia seeds, your cruciferous like broccoli and bok choy, and the edamame beans, lentils, and also blackstrap molasses is a good source of calcium. And then add some fortified products in maybe orange juice, soy milk, or tofu, but make sure that they are fortified. Not all of them are. And you want to make sure if you're cutting back on those animal products, which of course our standard American diet recommends we cut back on those, that you're going to want to substitute these plant sources of protein. And those include your beans, your lentils, your split peas, your soy, instead of the meat, fish, and poultry. And then reduce the intake of sodium. So that's going to include the cheese that we mentioned, but also all canned foods foods are usually high in sodium unless they are sodium free specifically. And then your snack items like, your potato chips and pretzels, just about anything that comes in a package is going to have sodium added. Take a minimum of 800 international units of vitamin D. That's the bare bones minimum. But most people take anywhere from 2,000 to 5,000 a day. And then that chewable or sublingual 50 micrograms a day of B12. Some recommend taking, particularly if you're over 50, to take more like 1,000 micrograms a day of B12. If you're deficient, it causes nerve pain, which can be irreversible. So you don't want to be deficient in B12. So here's how we water it down for you. Basically, you don't have to remember anything else that we said today other than you should be consuming a diet that's rich in plant sources, particularly plant sources of protein, plant sources of antioxidants, and plant sources of the minerals that all help you build healthy bones. And that includes vegetables, legumes, nuts, and seeds. And then to consume fewer, if any, of these animal products like meat and poultry, dairy, and high sodium foods. And if you are going to have fish, that you limit it to 3 ounces per week, particularly if you're pregnant or nursing. So here's my contact information. You can send me an email if you have a question. I think most importantly, the website across the bottom has a lot of resources for you. For example, there is a nutrition assessment tool there. It's only 19 very quick little questions about how much do you eat of certain foods. And you answer these questions and it gives you a score. And then it provides for you a key. So if you score, say, above a 4, then you go to the key and you say, well, here's some key points that you can do to improve your diet intake. It's a very simple tool. Also, I have many presentations that are archived on the website that you can watch in your own time, and there are downloadable handouts that you can use for yourself or for your family, or you can put them in the lobbies of your offices. As the chair of the Food and Nutrition Group in Coos County, I also create a monthly newsletter, and if you're interested in receiving that newsletter as well as getting flyers for my upcoming classes that I do in Coos and Curry, and the monthly webinar that I do every month on the 4th Thursday at 10 o'clock in the morning, I do a webinar. And the next webinar coming up, I believe, is on nutrition and arthritis. And that's all I have for you today. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you.
They got a van. So what did they do? Called on their granddaughter to drive them through.
Hi, I'm Amanda Fugate-Moss, writer and producer.
I'm Timothy Patrick Murphy, songwriter and composer.
Driving the Daisies is a dramedy musical that explores what it's like to lose independence and have to rely on others as we age.
Fun, authentic, and very bold, Driving the Daisies tells the tough stories of aging, disease, and loss of independence while using humor and music to keep the audience engaged. It tells the real stories of these dismissed generations through our eyes. We have a strong vision about this project with a lot of stories to share. We know what it can accomplish when it comes to fruition. We have a lot of interest, but we still need your support to make it a reality.
My inspiration for this show was Ernest Thompson, Norman Lear, and Rachel Bloom. I was honored to take care of my grandparents, that's them, full-time for 2 years. The greatest lesson I learned was how truly difficult it was for them to lose their independence and have to ask for assistance. It got me thinking that there's just so much that we just don't understand or we can't relate to because we haven't gone through it yet. Things that when shared with the public can help us all to have a better understanding of what's involved in the aging process. Many shows make reference to the older generations, but they gloss over the real health issues, while focusing primarily on the youth. Representation like this is very difficult to find on TV.
When you contribute to our campaign, you're supporting a woman-driven show made up primarily of older cast and crew that uplifts and supports the voices of the aging generations of men and women going through the aging process right now. Driving the Daisies tells their stories through their perspective while raising awareness within our society without judgment.
A dick, a dick-a-doo, a dick-a-dick-a-doo. I used to be able to dance. I can't dance anymore.
Thank you so much for helping us bring Driving the Daisies to fruition.
Driving the daisies all the way back home.